Picture this. It's 1943, and while German soldiers on the Eastern Front are dying, not from Russian bullets, but from typhus and gangrene because there's no fuel to evacuate them, an American GI in the Pacific gets shot in the thigh. Within 4 hours, he's in surgery. Within 3 days, he's on a plane to Hawaii. Within 2 weeks, he's eating ice cream in a California hospital. This wasn't magic. This was logistics. And it terrified the Axis powers more than any bomber ever could. Because here's what nobody tells you about World War II. America didn't just outshoot the enemy. They outsupplied them. They turned medicine into a weapon. They proved that a malaria pill delivered to a jungle foxhole could be just as deadly to the enemy as a grenade. That DDT powder could win battles. That the ability to move a wounded soldier from jungle to operating table faster than the enemy could blink was worth more than a dozen tanks. The Germans and Japanese had scientists, they had doctors. What they didn't have was 50,000 tons of medical supplies moving across 2 oceans every month like clockwork. They didn't have planes turned into flying hospitals. They didn't have the industrial might to mass-produce miracle drugs while simultaneously building the world's largest navy. This is the story of how America weaponized compassion, militarized mercy, and turned the humble supply chain into the Axis powers' worst nightmare. This is the story of the war that was won not just on battlefields, but in factories, on cargo ships, and in field hospitals where American efficiency met American abundance and changed warfare forever. The Invisible Arsenal, America's medical war machine, August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, 0600 hours, private first class, James Morrison pressed his back against the wet bark of a banyan tree, his rifle barrel pointing toward a Japanese position he couldn't see through the morning mist. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of bullets, but from something that had been building in his body for 3 days. First came the chills that made his teeth chatter despite the 90-degree heat. Then the fever that turned his vision into a watery blur. Now the sweats that soaked through his uniform and made his hands slip on the rifle stock. He'd heard the rumors from the old salts who'd seen action in previous island campaigns. More men evacuated for malaria than combat wounds. Entire companies reduced to skeletal crews, not by Japanese fire, but by a parasite delivered through a mosquito's proboscis. In the history of human warfare, from the Roman legions to Napoleon's armies, this microscopic enemy had killed more soldiers than all the swords, bullets, and bombs ever forged. Morrison didn't know it yet, but he was standing at ground zero of the Pacific War's first major test, not of courage or firepower, but of America's ability to fight a war on 2 fronts, one against the Japanese Empire, the other against Plasmodium falciparum, the single-celled organism that had stopped more invasions than any fortress wall. 300 miles away on a transport ship designated Medical Supply Vessel 47 sat 847,000 tablets of atabrine, each one stamped with the U.S. Army Medical Corps insignia. The ship's manifest also listed 12,000 mosquito nets, 3,000 gallons of insect repellent, and 150,000 pairs of long-sleeve shirts impregnated with a new chemical compound that made mosquitoes die on contact. The vessel was one of 57 supply ships that month alone dedicated not to ammunition or fuel, but to fighting an enemy invisible to the naked eye. The Japanese, meanwhile, had exactly 1 pharmaceutical factory capable of producing quinine, and it was in Tokyo, 6,000 miles from the front lines. Their supply chain consisted of whatever they could loot from captured Dutch plantations in Java. This wasn't a fair fight. This was a massacre. The question was, which side would be massacred? Morrison made it to the aid station at 1300 hours, half carried by 2 men from his squad. The battalion surgeon, Captain William Hayes, took one look at his jaundiced eyes and trembling hands and knew the diagnosis before checking his temperature. 104.3 degrees. Classic malaria presentation. "Atabrine," Hayes said to the corpsman. "Load him up." The corpsman reached into a metal supply case, newly arrived yesterday, and pulled out a small amber bottle. Inside were tablets the color of bright mustard, each one containing zero point 0.1 grams of quinacrine hydrochloride, the synthetic antimalarial that American chemists had rushed into production after Japan seized the world's quinine supplies in early 1942. Hayes watched Morrison swallow the first dose and made a mark in his log. 3 tablets daily for 5 days, then 1 daily as a suppressive. The same regimen being administered simultaneously to 14 other men in this battalion alone, to 847 men across the division, to tens of thousands across the Pacific Theater. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they were data points in the largest medical logistics operation in human history. Every tablet consumed, every case of malaria, every day lost or saved was being tracked, tabulated, and transmitted back to the War Department in Washington. The United States wasn't just fighting disease, it was treating war itself as an engineering problem with measurable inputs and outputs. By 1944, the U.S. Army would be distributing 3.5 million atabrine tablets per month in the Pacific Theater alone. The drug would be manufactured in 14 different facilities across the continental United States, shipped via rail to West Coast ports, loaded onto supply vessels operating on precise schedules coordinated by a logistics apparatus that made the Japanese supply system look like a corner grocery store. The numbers told a story that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. In the 1942 Guadalcanal campaign, 75% of casualties were disease-related, mostly malaria. In the 1944 Philippines campaign, 15% of casualties were disease-related. By 1945 in Okinawa, 5% of casualties were disease-related. The curve wasn't just bending, it was breaking. And on the other side of the Pacific, Japanese commanders were watching their armies literally dissolve from within. September 1943, Rabaul, New Britain, Imperial Japanese Army Forward Medical Post. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stared at the 27 men lying on bamboo mats in what was optimistically called a field hospital. 23 of them were shivering with malarial fevers. None had seen combat. They'd been rendered combat ineffective by an enemy they couldn't shoot. The medical supplies inventory Yamamoto had received that morning contained 47 quinine tablets for a garrison of 1,200 men, 12 mosquito nets, most with holes, and exactly 0 anti-malarial drugs of any kind. The supply convoy that was supposed to arrive 3 weeks ago had been sunk by American submarines. The convoy before that had been diverted to reinforce Burma. The convoy before that had never left Tokyo due to fuel shortages. Yamamoto had been trained at Tokyo Imperial University, one of the finest medical schools in Asia. He understood epidemiology, tropical medicine, pharmacology. What he couldn't understand, what kept him awake at night on his own fever-ridden bamboo mat, was how the Americans seemed to have infinite supplies of everything, while the Japanese Empire, which controlled half of Asia, couldn't get basic medicine to its troops. He didn't know about the 500,000 tons of shipping dedicated solely to medical supplies that the U.S. had deployed across the Pacific. He didn't know about the warehouses in San Francisco storing enough anti-malarial drugs to treat every person in Japan 3 times over. He didn't know about the 2,700 cargo vessels in the American Merchant Marine or the 1-200 Liberty ships being mass-produced at a rate of 1 per day. What he did know was that yesterday 3 more men died of blackwater fever, a malaria complication that turns urine the color of coffee as kidneys shut down, and that he had nothing to give them except cold compresses and prayers to ancestors who seemed to have stopped listening. The Imperial Japanese Army would lose approximately 127,000 soldiers to disease in the Pacific Theater during World War II, compared to 90,000 killed in action. The Americans would lose 13,000 to disease and 105,000 to enemy action. The mosquito had chosen sides, and its choice had been determined not by ideology or courage, but by manufacturing capacity and supply chain management. October 12, 1943, Naples, Italy, Allied occupation, day 3. The smell hit Colonel James Stevens before he even entered the city proper. It was the smell of a civilization in collapse. raw sewage running in the streets, garbage piled 10 feet high against walls pocked with artillery holes, and underneath it all, the sweet sickly odor of bodies that hadn't been collected because there was no one left to collect them. Stevens was the chief medical officer for the Fifth Army, a position that usually involved coordinating field hospitals and surgical teams. Today he was standing at the epicenter of what could become the worst public health disaster of the war in Europe, an epidemic that could kill more Allied soldiers than the German Wehrmacht. Typhus, epidemic typhus, transmitted by body lice, the same disease that had destroyed Napoleon's Grand Army in Russia in 1812, killing 400,000 men, the same disease that had killed 3 million people during World War I's Eastern Front, the same disease that was now exploding through Naples' population like a wildfire through dry brush. The numbers from the Italian health authorities were terrifying. 3,000 confirmed cases in the city, with the rate doubling every 5 days. The louse vector was everywhere, in clothing, in bedding, in the hair of nearly every civilian the Allies encountered. And Allied soldiers, living in close quarters, sharing equipment, moving through the same streets, were perfect targets for the next wave of infection. Stevens had studied the history. He knew what happened when typhus got into an army. During World War I, the Serbian army had lost 150,000 men to typhus in a single winter, more than they'd lost in 3 years of combat. The Russian Civil War had seen 25 million typhus cases and 3 million deaths. He pulled out a notebook and did the math. Fifth Army, 180,000 men. If typhus achieved even a 10% infection rate with the typical 20% mortality, that was 3,600 dead soldiers, equivalent to losing 3 full regiments without firing a shot. And that assumed they could keep it at 10%, which every historical precedent said was wildly optimistic. Stevens picked up the field telephone and connected to Allied Force headquarters in Algiers. "We need DDT," he said. "All of it. Everything you can get here. And we need it yesterday." What happened next would be a case study in military logistics taught in staff colleges for the next 80 years. Within 48 hours, the first shipment arrived, 50,000 pounds of DDT powder in sealed drums, each marked with production dates from facilities in Cincinnati, Newark, and Los Angeles. The chemical, dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, had been in mass production for less than a year. In that time, American industry had scaled from experimental batches to 4.5 million pounds per month. Behind the DDT came the distribution apparatus, 200 hand-pump dusting devices, 50 vehicle-mounted sprayers, and 200 medical corpsmen trained in delousing procedures. The equipment had been manufactured in St. Anne. Louis, shipped to Norfolk, crossed the Atlantic on troop ships that had returned from delivering reinforcements to Britain and arrived in Naples with the speed of a priority military operation, which is exactly what it was. The operation began at dawn on October 15th. Medical teams moved through the city block by block, building by building. Civilians were processed through delousing stations set up in school buildings and churches. Clothing was removed, dusted with DDT powder from nape to ankle, then returned. The white powder covered people like snow, settling into collars and cuffs, killing lice on contact. The scale was unprecedented. In the first week, 1.3 million Neapolitan civilians were dusted with DDT. In the second week, the teams processed another 800,000. The Americans brought an industrial efficiency to public health that Naples hadn't seen since the Roman Empire. Contrast this with the German response to typhus on the Eastern Front. When epidemic typhus broke out among Wehrmacht troops in 1941, the German Medical Corps had exactly one response: quarantine and hope. They didn't have DDT. The chemical had been discovered by a Swiss chemist, but Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce it at scale while also manufacturing tanks, planes, and ammunition. They didn't have enough delousing stations. They didn't have enough medicine. They didn't have enough of anything except casualty reports. The result, German Army records show approximately 80,000 cases of typhus on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1943, with mortality rates ranging from 15% to 40%, depending on the sector and the availability of medical care. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective not by Soviet artillery, but by Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacteria that causes typhus. By contrast, the Naples typhus epidemic, which should have infected hundreds of thousands and killed tens of thousands, peaked at 5,200 cases and then collapsed. The infection rate dropped by 80% within 2 weeks of the DDT operation. By December 1943, typhus had been effectively eliminated from Naples. It was the first time in human history that a major typhus epidemic had been stopped in its tracks rather than simply burning itself out after consuming enough victims. Colonel Stevens walked through the Piazza del Plebiscito 6 weeks after the operation began. The garbage had been cleared. The sewage system was being repaired. The smell of death had been replaced by the smell of DDT, a faint chemical odor that would become one of the defining scents of Allied victory. He thought about the Wehrmacht medical officers on the Eastern Front, watching their soldiers die of typhus because there was no DDT, no supply chain to deliver it, no industrial base to manufacture it at the scale needed. He thought about the Japanese medical corps dealing with malaria without adequate quinine supplies. He thought about the fundamental asymmetry of this war. The Axis powers had started World War II believing that will and ideology could overcome material disadvantage. They were learning, too late, that the modern war was won not just on battlefields, but in factories, warehouses, and cargo holds. That the nation which could deliver 50,000 pounds of insecticide to a recently captured city within 48 hours had a kind of power that all the panzer divisions in Germany couldn't match. Stevens pulled out a pen and wrote in his report to Fifth Army headquarters, "The typhus operation in Naples demonstrates that epidemic disease can be controlled through the application of industrial-scale medical logistics. Recommend immediate expansion of DDT production and distribution networks for all theaters of operation." The War Department would read that report and respond by increasing DDT production to 10 million pounds per month by mid-1944. It would be sprayed in barracks, spread on battlefields, dusted on prisoners of war, and shipped to every theater from Alaska to Australia. The Axis powers would have no equivalent response, not because they lacked the scientific knowledge. German and Japanese scientists understood typhus and malaria as well as their American counterparts, but because they lacked the one thing that mattered most in modern war, the ability to turn knowledge into action at scale. June 8, 1944, Normandy, France, Diplo 2. Sergeant Robert Chen had been in France for exactly 37 hours when the artillery shell hit. He didn't remember the explosion. Memory formation tends to stop when your brain is processing that level of trauma. What he remembered was opening his eyes and seeing his left leg bent at an angle that legs aren't supposed to bend, blood pooling in his boot, and a medic with a morphine syringe already in hand. "Stay with me, Sarge," the medic said, jabbing the morphine into Chen's thigh. The pain went from screaming agony to distant throb in seconds. "We're getting you out." In World War I, Chen would have been loaded onto a stretcher, carried to a horse-drawn ambulance, driven over cratered roads to a field hospital 10 miles behind the lines, and waited anywhere from 6 to 72 hours for surgery, assuming he survived the shock, blood loss, and infection that killed half of all men with comparable wounds. In World War II, this is what happened instead. 0800 hours, Chen wounded, medic applies tourniquet, administers morphine, attaches casualty tag. 0820 hours, stretcher bearers carry Chen 200 yards to battalion aid station, plasma transfusion begun to counter shock. 0915 hours, ambulance jeep evacuates Chen to divisional clearing station 2 miles behind lines. Wound assessed, sulfanilamide powder applied to prevent infection, additional plasma given. 10:45 hours, Chen loaded onto C-47 transport aircraft, converted to air ambulance. The plane carries 18 litter cases. 1220 hours, plane lands at field hospital in England. Chen is in surgery within 30 minutes. Total time from wounding to operating table, 4 hours and 20 minutes. The system that saved Chen's life had been designed, tested, and refined over 3 years of war. It was called the chain of evacuation, and it represented perhaps the single most important medical innovation of World War II, more important than any drug or surgical technique, because it made every other medical advancement actually matter. The architect of this system was Brigadier General Paul Hawley, chief surgeon of the European Theater of Operations. Hawley had studied the casualty data from World War I and drawn a simple but radical conclusion: speed saved lives. Not speed in surgery, most surgeons were already working as fast as humanly possible, but speed in getting wounded men to surgeons. In World War I, the average time from wounding to definitive surgical care was 18 hours. The mortality rate from wounds was 8.3%. In World War II, Hawley aimed to reduce that evacuation time to under 6 hours. If he succeeded, he predicted mortality would drop below 5%. Making this happen required treating wounded soldiers like cargo in a supply chain, a morbid comparison but militarily accurate. It required dedicated evacuation routes, standardized medical equipment, trained personnel at every stage, and above all, dedicated transportation. The centerpiece of the system was aerial evacuation. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces would fly over 1 million wounded soldiers from forward areas to rear hospitals. These weren't casual operations. They were precision logistics missions with the same priority as ammunition supply. Dedicated air ambulance squadrons operated C-47s fitted with litter racks, medical supplies, and flight nurses trained in airborne emergency care. The numbers tell the story. Mediterranean Theater, 1943-1944, 170,000 casualties evacuated by Air European Theater, 1944-1945, 418,000 casualties evacuated by Air Pacific Theater, 1942-1945, 387,000 casualties evacuated by air. Compare this to the German system. The Luftwaffe did have dedicated medical evacuation aircraft, the Ju-52, but chronic fuel shortages meant they flew sporadically. German wounded on the Eastern Front often waited days for evacuation, assuming evacuation came at all. When Soviet forces cut supply lines, German casualty clearing stations became death traps where thousands of wounded simply died waiting for transport that never arrived. The Japanese situation was even worse. Japan's military doctrine emphasized offense over logistics, and wounded soldiers were considered a burden. Medical evacuation from Pacific Islands was almost non-existent. Wounded men were left in place with minimal care. Japanese military records show that isolation and neglect killed as many wounded soldiers as their initial injuries. Sergeant Chen woke in a hospital bed in Southampton, his leg in traction, clean bandages covering the surgical site, and a nurse checking his pulse. He'd been unconscious for the surgery, pentothal sodium followed by ether anesthesia, and had no memory of the debridement procedure that had saved his leg from gangrene. The surgeon who'd operated on him, Major Thomas Wilson, was already working on his next case. In a 12-hour shift, Wilson would perform 17 surgical procedures, 8 debridements, 4 amputations, 3 arterial repairs, and 2 abdominal explorations. Each patient had arrived at his table within hours of being wounded, with blood loss controlled, shock treated, and infection prevented by sulfanilamide. Wilson had done his medical training at Johns Hopkins in the 1930s. Back then, the standard teaching was that combat wounds couldn't be primarily closed. They had to be left open to drain, which often led to massive infection and lengthy healing times. Now, thanks to sulfa drugs and rapid evacuation, Wilson was closing wounds that would have been death sentences a decade earlier. The mortality rate for wounded soldiers under Wilson's care, 3.8%. That number represented thousands of men like Chen who went home to their families instead of to graves marked with white crosses. To understand how America achieved this medical logistical miracle, you have to look beyond the front lines to the apparatus that fed them. The miracle wasn't in Naples or Normandy or Guadalcanal. It was in Cincinnati and Detroit and Los Angeles, in the factories and warehouses and transportation networks that turned American industrial might into medical supremacy. March 1943, Merck & Co. Pharmaceutical Plant, Rahway, New Jersey. The production line ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every 2.3 seconds, a tablet press punched out another atabrine tablet. The tablets moved down conveyor belts to packaging stations, where workers, mostly women since the men were fighting overseas, counted them into bottles of 100. The bottles went into wooden crates labeled with destinations: Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Australia, India, North Africa. The plant manager, a chemical engineer named Robert Clark, kept a running tally on a chalkboard: 8.4 million tablets this week, 34.6 million this month, 387 million since the start of 1943. These weren't just numbers. They were lives. Each tablet represented a soldier who wouldn't die of malaria. Each crate represented a company that would remain combat effective. Each trainload represented a division that could continue fighting. Merck wasn't alone. Across America, pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing drugs at unprecedented scales. Sulfanilamide production, 1.5 billion tablets per year. Penicillin production, 2.3 billion units per month by 1945, up from zero in 1941. Plasma production, 13 million units processed by American Red Cross. The scale was staggering, but scale alone wasn't enough. The drugs had to be packaged, shipped, stored, and distributed to tens of thousands of medical units scattered across 6 continents. This required a logistics network that rivaled the complexity of the Normandy invasion. The supply chain, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals produced in 127 U.S. facilities, primary distribution, rail transport to 4 major medical supply depots located strategically across the U.S., secondary distribution, truck transport to seaports, New York, Norfolk, San Francisco, Seattle, overseas, shipping, dedicated medical supply vessels, 237 ships by 1944, theater distribution, regional medical supply depots, 1 per Army group, tactical distribution, mobile medical supply companies, 1 per division, final delivery, battalion aid stations, and forward medical units. At each stage, supplies were tracked, inventoried, and requisitioned based on projected casualty rates and disease incidents. The U.S. Army Medical Department employed 7,400 supply officers whose sole job was ensuring that antibiotics, plasma, bandages, and equipment flowed continuously to the front lines. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their medical supply system was fragmented between the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Waffen-SS, with each branch maintaining separate procurement. Chronic shortages of everything from morphine to gauze meant German medics often operated with whatever they could scavenge from captured Allied supplies. The Japanese situation bordered on catastrophic. Japan's pharmaceutical industry was small and inefficient, and the naval blockade imposed by American submarines cut off access to raw materials. By 1944, Japanese medical units were using battlefield triage not to prioritize treatment, but to decide which wounded soldiers would receive medicine at all and which would be left to die. May 8, 1945, V-Day, Walter Reed Hospital, Washington, D.C., Colonel James Morrison, the same private who'd contracted malaria on Guadalcanal in 1942, stood in his dress uniform watching soldiers celebrate victory in Europe. The leg that had been shattered by Japanese shrapnel in 1943 had healed thanks to rapid evacuation and skilled surgery. The malaria that should have killed him had been controlled by atabrine. He'd been wounded twice more, evacuated 3 times, treated with penicillin for infected wounds that would have required amputation in any previous war. He'd survived not because he was lucky, but because he was American. Because behind him stood an industrial machine that had turned compassion into logistics, and logistics into victory. Morrison thought about the enemy soldiers he'd fought: Japanese infantrymen dying of malaria in New Guinea jungles, German wounded bleeding out in Russian snow because there was no fuel to evacuate them. Those men hadn't lacked courage. They'd lacked sulfanilamide, plasma, penicillin, DDT, atabrine. They'd lacked the C-47 air ambulances, the hospital ships, the endless supply convoys. The final casualty statistics would tell a story that military historians would analyze for decades. United States, combat deaths, 291,557. Disease deaths, 13,095. Wounded survived, 670,946. Survival rate for wounded, 96.5%. Germany. Combat deaths, 533,000. Disease deaths, 300,000. Estimated survival rate for wounded, 85%. Japan. Combat deaths, 120,000. Disease deaths, 127,000. Pacific theater only. Survival rate for wounded, 160%. The gap wasn't just numerical, it was philosophical. America had fought World War II as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. The Axis powers had fought it as an ideological crusade where willpower would overcome material disadvantage. They'd been wrong. Willpower doesn't cure malaria. Ideology doesn't stop typhus. Courage doesn't close arterial wounds. What wins wars is the ability to manufacture 8.4 million atabrine tablets per week, ship 50,000 pounds of DDT to Naples in 48 hours, and evacuate wounded soldiers from Normandy to London in under 5 hours. What wins wars is logistics so overwhelming that the enemy doesn't just lose, they're shocked that such a thing is even possible. The story of American medical logistics in World War II isn't taught in most history classes. Students learn about D-Day and Midway, about the Manhattan Project and strategic bombing, about generals and battles and turning points. They don't learn about the 500,000 tons of medical supplies shipped monthly, about the pharmaceutical factories running triple shifts, about the 1 million wounded soldiers evacuated by air. But the men who fought knew. They knew that when they went into battle, behind them stood not just tanks and planes, but an entire civilization dedicated to keeping them alive. They knew that a wounded American soldier had a better chance of survival in 1944 than a civilian in a major American city had in 1920. They knew that the humble supply truck, the cargo plane, the pharmaceutical factory, these were weapons as deadly to the enemy as any bomb. The Axis powers learned too late that modern war isn't won by the Army with the most courage or the best tactics. It's won by the nation that can deliver a malaria pill to a jungle foxhole, spray DDT on a conquered city, and fly a wounded soldier from battlefield to operating table before his blood pressure drops fatally low. Germany and Japan had built military machines designed for quick, decisive victories. America built a logistical machine designed to win wars of attrition through sheer industrial overwhelming force. When the quick victories didn't materialize, when the war turned into a grueling multi-year struggle of production and supply, there was only ever going to be one winner. The invisible arsenal, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, evacuation systems, supply chains, won World War II just as surely as radar, code-breaking, or atomic bombs. Maybe more so, because while technology can be copied and tactics can be learned, logistics at American scale required something the Axis could never replicate, a fully mobilized industrial economy, capable of simultaneously building the world's largest military, while also keeping every soldier in that military better supplied than any army in human history. That was the real shock. That was the victory that terrified the Axis. Not American courage, they'd expected that. Not American technology, they'd prepared for that. But American abundance, American efficiency, American logistics so overwhelming that dying of preventable disease became rare while the enemy died of it by the hundreds of thousands. In the end, World War II was won by men who never fired a shot. Factory workers in New Jersey, truck drivers in France, supply officers tracking inventory, pharmaceutical chemists optimizing production. They built the invisible arsenal that shocked the world and secured victory, and every soldier who came home alive was a testament to their triumph.